I started fishing 6 years ago. I found fishing to be a great way to relax and get away from the crowd. About 3 years ago, I bumped into Melvin quite frequently as he was fishing at the same location and time as I was. As we only knew each other by sight, I decided to say hi and possibly also ask for some tips to improve my fishing skills.
Hey, you again. Hey.
Hi.
Regular spot for fishing, huh?
Yeah, I stay quite nearby.
I stay quite far away.
Oh, not bad lah, this place. Better than Woodlands.
Little did I know that our small talk that day grew into a strong friendship. We continued to fish together and also met up for supper and coffee. Soon, our conversations moved from just fishing to about our lives and our families.
Hey Melvin, how's your mom?
Okay. She's getting better. But this last few weeks, it's been really tough. I had to travel and then my wife had to take care of her on her own. It's been really hard on the family. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, sure. Just wanted to know and asking out of concern.
Caleb, Christian, right?
Yes, I am a Christian.
Maybe you can pray for me.
Yeah, sure. I'll pray for you and I'll pray for your family.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
You know, last week, I talked to you about the boat trip for fishing.
Yes?
My family managed to book one for next week.
That's great.
Yeah.
Good news. Yeah.
My wife, my kids, my father and mother, they're all coming along.
Oh, that's good.
Wondering whether you and your girlfriend would like to come.
Yeah, we would love to.
I found conversations the most enjoyable when we have an equal part in the conversation and no one dominates to be heard. Because therein lies a desire to hear one another out, share about each other's lives, and also to edify one another. I'm grateful for the many conversations I've had with Melvin.
Most evangelism trainings are based around us learning how to share the gospel message. Even when we are taught how to start a conversation in these trainings, the goal is still for us to find, you guessed it, an opportunity to share that gospel message. And we want to share the gospel message, fair enough, but what if we've done that already? What if they weren't interested? What if they said, "Good for you, I'm glad you found something that works for you," and walked away thinking, "I'm really pleased for them, they found their truth." We talked earlier in these seminars about what the gospel is and about how to share it. This is important and this is foundational. But we need to communicate this gospel within our culture. You might remember earlier, we talked about the different percentages who believed in a God and a higher power or who believed in neither. In New Zealand, 46% believed in a God, 31% in a higher power, and 19% either didn't know what they believed or were atheists. However, of that 46%, I put to you that the majority who believe in a God believe that all religions lead to that God. As a culture, we have rejected the idea of religious truth. We believe that all religions are essentially the same. And so the question is raised, how can you tell a person the truth when they don't believe that there is a religious truth? This is where a more conversational approach to evangelism proves beneficial. We can encourage people toward faith through conversation one step at a time, and this can be effective so long as we're proactive. Here are 6 benefits then of a conversational approach. First of all, it creates space for us to listen to other people before we speak. Too often we assume we've heard what people have said when really we haven't. You know, everyone likes talking, and a lot of us, if we're willing to admit it, we're poor listeners. You see, listening is more than keeping quiet. Listening is listening. For example, a person says they don't believe in a God. We might assume that they're an atheist, but the reason could be because they were angry at God for letting their grandmother die of some terrible disease. At a surface level, we might think we've heard what they said, but because we haven't asked, because we haven't taken the time to clarify, we actually haven't. We might turn to them and reason for God's existence, but it's of little benefit because the hindrance to their faith is more emotional than it is intellectual. Secondly, a second benefit of a conversational approach, it creates space for us to listen to God before we speak. Certainly Jesus is our role model in this. He asked questions in conversation, but his ability to hear the Spirit and to impact lives through the divine revelation he had was nothing short of amazing. We do well to remember that God can speak to us in the same way. Thirdly, it potentially opens an ongoing conversation. Everyone likes to talk. And if we listen and ask caring and insightful questions, other people will like to talk. In fact, they'll like us. And they'll be willing to talk with us again and again, which gives us the opportunity to be wise and directed in our questions. This can open some outstanding opportunities to encourage people a step at a time toward Jesus. A fourth benefit of a conversational approach is that it returns the onus of proof to the other person if they are criticizing. Sometimes when our faith is attacked, we want to stand in defense, but sometimes it is wiser to ask them what they mean, followed by asking them where they got that idea from. We may be able to find and illuminate the cracks in their arguments, causing them to see it for themselves rather than telling it, and all without having made statements ourselves, without having even disagreed, which is the next point. Through a conversational approach, it's less threatening. We can even disagree without disagreeing. The moment a person feels threatened or uneasy in a conversation in our culture, the conversation is likely to end. However, if we primarily use questions, and if we're intentional in projecting as much acceptance and encouragement as possible in the process, well, we give them no reason to feel threatened, even if we did disagree. And the end benefit of this is that the conversation continues toward an end product that might be point 6, sixth benefit of a conversational approach. They may be caused to reevaluate their beliefs. This is the final goal. If we merely state our beliefs or our opinion in a conversation, the conversation ends. But by wisely using questions, we can lead a conversation and come to the same conclusion, but one that they discovered for themselves, and it's far more effective. Imagine a person believes the Bible to be unreliable. Through nothing other than questions, they could be caused to reconsider this belief. Imagine a person who is adamant there is no God. Through nothing more than questions, they could be caused to see that their arguments may not be foolproof after all. And imagine a person who believes that all the religions are essentially the same. Well, they could be caused to see that actually that's logically a long stretch because they're majorly different in the major things, as it turns out. Each of these conversations opens a door for another conversation. And the end result could be a loved one who is able to again hear that same gospel message we earlier shared, but from an entirely different perspective. The scriptures tell us in 2 Corinthians 4:4 that the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. In our culture, most have rejected belief in spiritual truth, but we're not powerless in this equation. There are things that we can do. It is a spiritual battle, so we can pray. But the scriptures are clear that it is the mind that is blinded. Through conversation, we can try to understand exactly what they believe and why. And we might just find ourselves walking into some amazing and ongoing opportunities to encourage them toward Jesus. What was Jesus' method of evangelism and discipleship? He talked with people with an ear open to the Spirit. You see, Jesus asked questions, he listened, he conversed with his mind, but he listened to the Spirit's promptings, and God worked powerfully through him. This is the biblical method. It's a timeless method. It's a transcultural method. It's one we can imitate, talking with people with an ear open to the Spirit and God can work powerfully through us too. Where could we start? Well, we could begin by practicing our conversational skills, and we'll give you some ideas that could help you get started in the next seminar. A person I was talking to a couple of months ago told me how when she was 9, she heard Christians praying at the back of a church. Now she felt offended because they were praying that people from all across the world would all become Christians. However, now a working professional in her early 30s, she's interested to learn more about spiritual things, and especially the occult, because she knows she hasn't really given spiritual things that much thought, and they're important. Westerners are still spiritual. As Christians, we sometimes struggle to talk with them about spirituality, and the primary reason, as we've discussed, is probably because most of them have rejected the idea of religious truth, so they aren't really interested. In fact, some of them might even find our Christian beliefs offensive, like this young lady might have, but they're still interested in spiritual things. How can we talk with people like this? The reality is that most of us struggle to get conversations started on spiritual topics. Here are 4 tips. Number 1, remove the agenda of sharing the gospel. Now, I smile whenever I say this because I know some people will take offense and consider this like heresy, but I'm only suggesting to remove the agenda for a while. You see, it's because we have this agenda that we can't hold relaxed conversations about spiritual things with non-believers. The non-believer picks up on the fact that we have an agenda, and so they guard it. But also we as Christians maybe feel nervous because we're trying to get something across. So the easiest way to relearn how to have relaxed spiritual conversations is to remove that agenda for a while. Why not try it out and see what happens? Because you might begin to find that opportunities to share the faith are quite natural when we've learned again how to have a two-way conversation about spiritual things, without needing to push our own view or to always be right or to always give the whole story. Number 2, try to understand what they believe. Try to understand why also. Try to understand where they got those ideas from and what led them to that belief. How does it work? What do they think about Christian beliefs? What led them to reject Christian beliefs, if that's the case? Where did they come into contact with Christianity? Just keep asking questions. So long as we're not confronting them in an aggressive manner, arguing or showing disrespect, people are more than open to talk about this stuff. And there's also heaps of stuff that we could learn from them. If they're into alternate spirituality, try to understand their beliefs and how it works. If they believe in horoscopes, try to understand why they trust this and where that information comes from. Number 3, ask sincere questions about what you don't understand. If they say they believe all religions are the same, then ask in what way? What about the differences? Genuinely seek to understand, because it doesn't make sense to me. The world's religions seem to be majorly different in the major things, so ask about that. It's not to criticize, it's just to ask authentic questions. And in so doing, you might highlight to them some of the potentially massive flaws that exist in this kind of a worldview that often is adopted only because it's the current popular worldview, because it's non-confrontational, not because it's logical in any real sense. An article published in Science Daily in July 2011 revealed that scientists had found that when just 10% of a population held an unshakable belief in something, their belief would always be adopted by the majority of the society. Most people believe their beliefs because they're popular, not because they've thought about them in any real way. So having removed the agenda, investigated what they believe and asked sincere questions about the things you don't understand, or when appropriate, when the opportunity comes, share what makes sense to you and why. The fact is, the opportunities to talk about the reasons in favour of Christian faith and what it's all about will arise by themselves. And you'll be positioned to actually help the other person to expand their horizons of thought, because instead of having assumed what you think they believe and preached at them, you've now listened. You now understand what they believe and why and where they got those ideas from. You'll also have some rapport with them. You'll have some trust with them because you've had a conversation that you didn't make feel all awkward. The door is now open not only to pass on some information, but to potentially speak to their hearts. I had a memorable conversation with a guy on a plane a few months ago. He was a scientific kind of guy, and I asked what he did for a job, and he asked what I did, and I shared that I was involved in a 2014 project for the bicentenary of the gospel. And he just expressed that he didn't really want to talk about religion. So I said fine, and we talked about other things. Now, a few minutes later, he asked a question about the Christian faith. And I answered it briefly and then turned the conversation back to what we were talking about because we were having a really interesting conversation and he'd changed the topic. So what do you think he did? He asked more questions about the Christian faith. And so it continued for about an hour until everything had been said with him leading the conversation. Now, can you see how it worked? Let's break this conversation down. When he said that he didn't want to talk about religion, he wasn't saying he wasn't interested. In fact, he actually had spiritual views and believed we became floating spirits after we died. He was saying that he didn't want to be preached at. So I respected that boundary. He probably knew that we Christians have this little good deed that we do to try and tell people about Jesus. He didn't want to be someone's target. But when he asked that question, he was actually saying, well, dude, I'm actually interested in spiritual things, but can I trust you? And when I gave him a really concise reply, I was saying, dude, I'm more passionate about spiritual things than you can imagine. But yes, I've got the self-restraint to not have to give you all the information in one go and to not have to be right. In which case, his unspoken reply was, well, thanks, because actually I'm really interested and I'd love to talk about it. You see, and then throughout the conversation that followed, I respected him for his views, even though they were considerably different to my own. And by the end of it, everything had been said. He hadn't felt preached at. He had led the direction of most of the conversation. Now, he still didn't believe Christian things, but he knew a lot more about them. And he was very appreciative of an offer to pray for him and for his family regarding a challenging situation that they were facing at that time. Just consider if I'd been aggressive, if I'd had that agenda and I'd tried to push it. Well, there would have been no open-hearted conversation about spiritual things. But by being gentle and inquisitive, well, we had a great conversation and we both enjoyed it. People aren't scared of spiritual conversations. They're scared of being preached at. Some of us, we've become all awkward in our conversations because we have an agenda. But look, if that's your experience and you know that pushing your view isn't working, then why not try something new? Remove the agenda. Try to understand what they believe and why first. Ask questions about things you don't understand, and then, as the opportunity opens up, share what makes sense to you and why. Now, it might take some boldness for you to do this and initiate a conversation, especially if you believe that New Zealanders and Westerners won't be interested. But I suspect you'll discover what I've discovered also, that people are interested, and that with a conversational approach that doesn't judge people but just asks questions, opportunities can abound. I hope this has helped. This conversational technique I'm going to show you today was popularized in Christian circles by Gregory Kukul, who has a passion for training believers in conversational skills for the purpose of Christian witness. Now, he called it the Columbo tactic, naming it after an inept TV detective called Lieutenant Columbo, who kept discovering things quite by accident because he accidentally asked the right question at the right time. Questions like this, however, have been around for centuries, and I recall in my earlier years a gentleman who used to ask me these very questions when trying to understand what I was saying and how he could respond. These questions assume a conversation has already started, and they can be useful in a number of situations. For example, maybe someone makes a statement that you disagree with, or maybe asks a loaded question. How might you respond? Question 1. What do you believe by that? This question seeks to clarify what the person is saying. The greatest benefit of such a simple question is that it moves the onus of proof back to the person who's asking the question or making the accusation. It's extremely useful when discussing religious matters, where we'd prefer to have an ongoing conversation about spiritual things rather than to merely state our own opinion. For example, John says, as a part of a conversation, that he feels the Bible is unreliable. Or stated as a question, he asks, how can you trust the Bible when it's got so many mistakes in it? Instead of replying his question to defend the Bible, you could ask a question, returning the onus of proof to him. What do you mean by mistakes? What do you mean by unreliable? It's likely that his knowledge on the matter isn't great. And even if he had so knowledge, he could still be referring to any one of a number of popular criticisms that are levelled against the Bible. So it's worth asking. Question 2. What led you to that conclusion? This question seeks to clarify why a person believes what they're saying. Where did they get that information from? What led them to think or feel that way? In asking the second question, instead of starting to talk and replying their question, you've created a further opportunity to understand what they're thinking. But also to think about how you might best answer their original question and to consider where God might be in this picture. Why are they asking this question? What's motivating them? What's their real need? How might you best help them? You will not be able to impact their life very much for God if your answer fails to address the real issue. You see, it could be a doubt or an objection or a hurt or a personal need. But whatever it is, you won't be able to hit the target if you don't identify what the target is. For example, you're talking with John, who thinks the Bible's unreliable. You've asked him what he means by unreliable. Then you ask where he gets the idea from. And he says, well, I heard it on the Da Vinci Code. The way you'd answer his information coming from a fiction movie is pretty different to the way you'd reply were he to say that he got the information from a scholarly book by a famous skeptic, which would be different again to how you'd reply were he simply to say, oh, I don't know. And maybe he was simply saying it to put up a smoke screen and try to kill the conversation about spiritual things. Question 3 then follows these, and it is, have you considered? This third question seeks to redirect a person's thoughts in a direction that might be helpful to them. This is in reality a reply, but instead of making a statement, we word it as a question. For example, have you considered that the Da Vinci Code is just a movie? It's not history. Why do you think people like this keep attacking the Bible? By this time, if you observe what's happening, they have spoken 2 or 3 times and you have done nothing yet except ask questions. You've avoided going on the defensive when your beliefs had maybe been questioned or attacked. You've returned the onus of proof to the other person, but you've done this gently and respectfully. And by asking questions, you have positioned yourself now to hit the nail on the head. And after this, the next time he's maybe talking with a Christian, he might be a bit more interested himself because now he's got reasons to consider that the Bible might be reliable. As a final example, imagine Helen, and she says, I don't believe in God. Now, here's an opportunity. How are you going to respond? Try the questions. Question 1, what do you mean you don't believe in a God? Don't you think there's anything out there? Let's imagine she says, yeah, I think there's nothing out there. Now, at this point, it would seem that she's probably an atheist. She believes there is no God. And you could go ahead and give her a reply if you wanted to and tell her about the reasons for the existence of God and how amazing the universe is and life is. But hang on a minute. Have you really heard what she's saying? Let's imagine you now ask the second question. Where did you get that idea from? And then she replies, well, how can there be a God when there's so much suffering? You see, what does she really believe? Her objection isn't intellectual, it's more emotional. And if you were to ask another question, why do you say that? Maybe she'd reveal that her mother had died from a terrible illness, and she's been feeling bitter toward God ever since. You see, the way you'd respond to someone who believes there is no God is very different to how you'd respond to someone who's struggling with grief. And your logical next thing to do would be to ask about why she says that and to empathize. I'm sorry to hear about what happened to your mother. Do you really think God's responsible for that? And you could have a great conversation. Great questions are the key to great conversations. By learning to ask great questions like these, you can open a door to some truly meaningful conversations. You might even be able to help a person entirely reevaluate their beliefs. What do you mean by that? Where did you get that idea from? Have you considered? Why not try them out?
I got to know Esther in primary school. Now, some 20 years later, we still hang out for meals, exercise, shop, and even go on holidays together. About 10 years ago, something happened in Esther's life. She shared with me that she became a Christian. Even though I didn't share her enthusiasm, I was happy for her that she found something she could believe in. Since that day, I could see little changes in Esther. How she dealt with difficult situations, and how she would surrender all her problems to Jesus. There were times when I was going through difficult moments. Esther would offer to pray for me, and I would willingly accept. Although I was not a Christian then, I still believed that there was a higher being that we could all call out to. As Esther shared about Jesus and the faith, I got more and more curious about who this Jesus is. So when she invited me for a few of her church events, I willingly went. But how can we be sure that Jesus is truly God?
I think I can answer that question by telling you about my own journey of finding out who Jesus is.
To my surprise, I enjoyed the Alpha sessions. My group members were candid and funny, and even shared their own journeys of coming to know Jesus. They openly shared their lives with me, so I got to see how real God is and how He's been working in their lives. It really gave me an opportunity to know who this Jesus is, although I was not ready to make any decisions yet. On 23rd December 2014, at a church event, I finally decided to ask Jesus to come into my life. I didn't plan for it, but it just happened. I'm grateful to Esther for the many conversations we had over the past 10 years, where she had so patiently shared and explained to me about Christianity. Looking back, those conversations were part of my journey in coming to believe in Jesus.